The United States was the world's policeman, but is getting ever more reluctant in its role. Does its reluctance to intervene in Syria signal the end of the American imperial concept? Is bringing democracy to the rest of the world just too expensive? Join me, Jan Darasz, for How We Got Here.
Like Rome before it, America has tried to spread its political model. During the civil war in Syria, Washington used its military might and finances to compel now ousted Syrian President Bashar al-Assad to accept major constitutional reforms of a democratic nature. The US has also armed and otherwise supported the Syrian Democratic Forces, also known as the SDF, which led to the establishment of a de facto semi-state in northeastern and eastern Syria. Still, Washington's bet on the secular and left-leaning SDF seemed not attractive enough, while at the same time drawing suspicious looks from Turkey, which regards the SDF's military leadership as a terrorist group. But even before the US became interested in exporting democratic models to Syria, Korea came to be the first post-World War II receiver of American values. The case of South Korea proved that the US could entrench an American-style presidential system with a separation of powers, capitalist economy, democratic governance, and even hustle culture, known in Korean as papali papali. The US supported the state during the Vietnam War, attempting to establish a non-communist government, but the extensive military and economic aid could not fix the South Vietnamese government's corruption and unpopularity. Eventually, the fall of Saigon in 1975 put an end to US efforts, leading to the unification of Vietnam under communist control. Somalia was even less successful. A civil war ravaged the country for years, leading to a widespread famine in 1992. Initially dispatched to alleviate the hunger, the United Nations troops began trying to establish democracy and restore a central government. US forces became embroiled in a manhunt for one of the warlords whose militia obstructed peace efforts. The mission culminated in the infamous Black Hawk Down incident, where 18 soldiers were killed and many others were wounded. The event pushed Washington to rethink its involvement and brought about the American withdrawal in 1994. The invasion of Afghanistan showed that Washington did not learn the lessons from Somalia. Once again, the US became engaged in nation-building in a country characterized by complex tribal and ethnic composition. Western political and social systems fell on deaf Afghan ears and turned out incapable of replacing traditions and Islamic principles. Despite substantial investments, the US-imposed democratic Afghan government struggled with corruption, lack of legitimacy, and dependence on foreign aid. Neither did the US unravel the knot of various ethnic and religious groups often conflicting interests in Iraq. Having disposed of Saddam Hussein fairly easily, Washington's empowerment of the Shia Muslims inadvertently marginalized the Sunnis. This, coupled with the dismantling of the Iraqi military and the Ba'ath Party, strengthened al-Qaeda, eventually leading to the rise of ISIS. Whether the removal of Assad from the picture will contribute to the resurgence of ISIS is difficult to assess, but the main challenger to the US presence in Syria may be Turkey, not ISIS. On December the 8th, Turkey-backed rebels captured the city of Manbij. Recently, the US brokered a ceasefire between the rebels and the Kurds.
Nobody knows what's going to happen with Syria, but I think Turkey is going to hold the key to Syria, actually.
With the various rebel groups entertaining Islamist solutions to Syria's post-Assad uncertainties, perhaps Turkey's equally Islamist Erdogan ideology will resonate better with the Syrian population, better than stars and stripes from across the greater water, and the old Roman strategy of divide and rule.
We're joined today by our guest Marcin Burzański, from the Centre of Diplomacy and Negotiation at the Collegium Civitas, based here in Warsaw. Welcome to the programme.
Hello, very glad to be here.
American intervention, that's our subject for today. And they seem to be reluctant to intervene in Syria. What's the history of this reluctance to intervene totally as they should, perhaps? Well, especially in Syria.
I would say in many instances they are very right to have this reluctance. If you look at the history of U.S. engagement in the Middle East, well, there are a lot of bad experiences with interventions, especially interventions with the aim to create a new political system in a situation of chaos with post-dictatorship. I think Iraq being the best example, yes, where the U.S. did intervene at that point to get rid of a dictator, which was Saddam Hussein. Here it is the rebels that got rid of Bashar al-Assad, but the de facto situation on the ground is that there is a composition of tribes, of armed groups, all who could take part of governing of Syria or hold at the moment control over different parts of its territory, and to intervene in any way militarily in order to create or build a system around this composition without a, well, let's be clear, full blown out military occupation, which would go into the hundreds of thousands of troops and countless budget and the dollar figure that would be attached to it. It's hard to imagine how such an intervention could provide the political gains or political results that the U.S. would have wanted from a situation like this. And of course, when we look at Syria, we have to look back at how we got to this situation. There was the so-called Arab Spring and then the uprisings of 2011, where at the beginning the U.S. has been involved in supporting some groups on the ground in their uprising against Assad, but of course that turned out to a bloody civil war where the dictator was sustained primarily through Iranian support via their proxy Hezbollah in Lebanon, as well as of course Russian intervention in 2015, yes, which has de facto saved Assad. And we should also remember in 2015 those famous red lines, which were the use of chemical weapons, have been
coming towards us,
have been broken, and at that point the U.S. could have engaged enough, let's say, military power to really hit hard at Assad, support the rebels. It refused to do so. I think having in mind, of course, there are lessons from Iraq, but also there are lessons from Libya, which is another case in point.
The Europeans do that,
and I'm coming sort of to Libya. We're still in the Middle East, but there also a dictator was overthrown in a rebellion that was aided by a NATO military operation, of course led by the United States, with air support, with all intelligence, with dismantling the Gaddafi regime's operation. But behind it, there was no governing structure in Libya to take on what was left behind the regime. And that is something the U.S. didn't want to happen in Syria. At that point, they saw this as an easy entry point for the strengthening of two strongest groups at the time in Syria, which on one hand were the Shia tribes connected with Assad, which means, of course, proxies of Hezbollah and Iran. So it would mean strengthening Iran. On the other hand, this was the height of power of the so-called Islamic State, which was at that point the strongest, the biggest terrorist organization in the world and the prime concern for the U.S. So bringing in more chaos into Syria at that point would strengthen the so-called Islamic State and their operation, something that the U.S. didn't want. So these have been the considerations of the U.S. not to intervene, but they had, I think, thought at that point about consequences, geopolitical consequences, where through a number of actors, China, but Russia in particular, the U.S. has been seen as weak, as not coming through with their very strong statements and enforcing of red lines. And this has, well, provided an open space for Putin on how he intervened and changed the course of events in Syria, and it also has led him, I believe, to continue with further aggressive actions in different places in the world.
This idea of not having chaos, not creating chaos or not leaving chaos, is that a major factor in how the United States thinks about intervention? It's not just the dollars that it expends on the petrol or the ammunition or the lives of its military personnel, but how it seems reluctant to allow a situation of chaos, anarchy to prevail.
Certainly, it is one of the key considerations, but I wouldn't say it's an only one. There'll always be a variety of factors that will need to be considered before those decisions are taken. Stability in a region that is known to be unstable and prone to volatility and prone to the emergence of terrorist groups or organizations is important, of course, but there are also broader geopolitical and regional considerations. There's, of course, the question of how instability would influence, for instance, the price of oil. And these are all important considerations, but they have been changing in time. If we go back to a very important, of course, event, the September 9/11 attacks, and what came after, so the intervention in Afghanistan, yes. the so-called war on terror. It placed the Middle East, the broad Middle East, and of course Central Asia, we're thinking about Afghanistan, into the spotlight, into a strategic focus, and a lot analysts are now saying that it took the US's eyes off the broader strategic competition, thinking, of course, about China and Russia, as we're seeing today. But the problems that emerged, the failures, I think we have to put them that way, and the associated incredible cost, and not just in terms of human lives lost of soldiers, not to mention the societies in those countries, but the $1 trillion price tags that are attached to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, also meant that the US was very reluctant to engage in any kind of intervention that would have similar level of engagement and could potentially end up in the same place when it comes to consequences. Also, it became clear by the 2010s and later on that the focus needs to be put somewhere else, that is into Southeast Asia, into China, and that although the U.S. has very strongest military presence of any country still in the Middle East, there are bases, there's bases in Djibouti, there's bases in Doha, Qatar, there are bases spread out in Iraq and many other places, that their main aim is to keep stable at this point, rather than really try to recreate or reshape a political structure by building countries and building political systems. I think that's a lesson learned.
Yes. Is there any overarching strategic thought about American policy? We know it's a global policy. It has global issues, obviously. In the 1990s, there was this neocon idea of, we've won the Cold War, capitalism has won, we're going to remodel the world in our image. Is there any governing ideology that's driving United States policy now, or is it one of keeping stability, not creating chaos, not going into a war that costs too much, these practical issues?
I think that strategic notion has changed a lot. I don't think anybody today in Washington would like to talk about spreading democracy around the world. I think this...
America still promotes that idea of America as this universal. If you listen closely,
there's much more talk about freedom and about inclusion and allowing of societies to live freely and choose their own systems, but not necessarily have a democratic system constructed in such a way that we know it. trying to impose it has failed and failed brutally. And it's a combination, of course, of factors, be it cultural, historical, institutional, the advancements of who also creates as a polity a country. Sometimes you've got tribes simply that will be fighting for their own part of power and not constructing systems or institutions to govern relations between them. That just didn't fly. And even if it potentially could, theoretically, it might require incredible engagement up to a, let's say, occupation type of force to do it, which potentially could not even work as well. So this stopped being a policy priority, a policy concept, even I would say in the U.S. But at the same time, the aspect of peaceful or let's say managed conflicting relations between states and countries that can be stabilized. I'm thinking about regional aspects for the Middle East or internally within countries, so that there's no civil war that spreads around and has its consequences, but there's some degree of stability that can continue and potentially open space for some kind of longer term solutions, still allowing the US to keep an eye on things, to keep a lid on things, to keep the trade going via key passages, to keep the main allies in place. This is a strategic objective. I think that the US for many years now is not looking at reshaping completely the Middle East, but to strengthen stabilization elements through their alliances and contain the enemies, right? That said, we cannot exclude completely some kind of changes and dynamics just because of events even we're seeing recently from the election of Donald Trump to the war in Gaza, apart, of course, from events in Syria.
If you're an empire, there's no one who asks you whether you want an empire. You're born into it. America is a hugely powerful state. To show weakness is worse than even showing an over use of force. America can't afford to be seen to be weak anywhere, because other strategists in China and Russia think of a multipolar world. Is that getting through to American strategists? Do they accept this idea of a multipolar world to share with enemies?
I think they understand more and more that some change is inevitable. It has actually already happened. So I even wouldn't go as far as calling the US now a global empire. I think they're the strongest actor. That would be a more appropriate term, because it's been very clear that the US doesn't have enough force, be it military or financial, to impose their political will on other regions and places. It is competing with other regions and places, and this competition takes many shapes and forms. In terms of the losing face factor that you're talking about, it's always a balancing game, because sometimes it's better to withdraw and lose a little bit of face than to continue in something that is completely disastrous. I think a good idea is, or a good example is the whole peace process or negotiation process that was going on in Afghanistan for many years. And while the US didn't reach a full settlement with the Taliban and bringing them partially into power, into a system that could be somehow managed and engage other actors, well, that resulted in the end by a super quick withdrawal that was a disastrous defeat, and that has shown actually a bigger weakness, and many analysts believe was one of the key factors in Vladimir Putin's decision to go ahead with his invasion in Ukraine.
It's like playing three-dimensional chess. Balanced on a big ball, yes. Marcin Burzański, thank you very much for coming on to the programme.
A pleasure to be here, thank you.
That's it. Do join us next time for How We Got Here.